we're going to go ahead and jump into the sixth and final session on WordPress Essentials. This one's going to be very technical. What I mean by technical, there's two parts of it. One of them is the actual how do we do this. That's where the technical side of this is. But there's a business side of this that what we would consider a business requirement. So we'll look at a number of things to do with what we call multi-site WordPress installations, and we'll talk about why some organizations would choose to have that, and whether or not this is a solution that makes sense for you while you're on this webinar, and others that will be looking at this later. So let's talk a little bit about this concept called multi-site WordPress websites. This is what we're ultimately covering today. There's actually a number of steps to make sure it gets set up properly in the first place. Once it does, it actually can be a very powerful tool. So first of all, what is a multi-site website? We're going to talk about that. We're going to look at some advanced web tools to kind of make sure that your website performs really well, whether it's multi-site or not, but there's some caching options and some ways to handle if your website gets a lot of traffic all at once. And then we'll take a look a little bit about some of the e-commerce and payment type of things that are out there. Again, for probably, even in my business, if I was to look at all of the clients that we've serviced over the last several years, we have probably a handful of e-commerce and technical clients. Even we have about 4 that are using this multi-site strategy. Everybody else has a single WordPress install and a single website that's mostly informational, but not transactional. And what we mean by transactional is typically money is taking place through the website. So typically e-commerce or transactional websites require a little bit more technical elements. That's, again, a handful of clients out of all the clients we service really ever fit that mold. So we are going to cover that, and we're going to take a look at a couple things here that might be helpful in determining whether that's the type of site that you need for your organization. So here we go. The multi-site environment, these are the elements that make it up, and we'll go through each one of them. Again, this is where it will get technical, but before we dive into that, essentially what a multi-site WordPress site is all about is you have a single login and you can manage multiple websites with multiple website addresses all under one interface. So if you have, abc.com and you also own abc.org and you own abc.net and you want all 3 of those to be totally separate websites with different look and feel, you can do that under this thing called a multi-site WordPress install. And so that multi-site gives you the ability to map each domain to each website so that each one pulls up the right information. It looks the way you want it to look. But when you log in, you have the tools to manage everything there. And I'll show you a couple examples of that, and I'll show you why that makes sense for these organizations. And then, again, we'll look at how to set one up. We'll go through the process of that and then discover if there's anything out of that process that's of any value. So this one right here, this is a local client to Greenville. They are a property management company. So what they do is they own a number of basically apartment complexes. So they own some on the student housing market, so up near USC, and they have another one up in Spartanburg. They also have a couple of regular apartment complexes that they manage. So they actually have the need to say, you know what, we are a property management company. That's who they are. They have their own website, but each of the properties they manage needs to have a different website. And they may actually have one person that manages them all, which in this case, my team typically manages most of the updates. But they also have the ability, if they want specific people to manage or update specific sites, we can actually give them a login where they only see the site that they're responsible for. So if maybe, say you're an apartment manager and you need to update pricing or email and office hours and all that stuff, and it's on your website, you want to be able to log in and only manage yours. You don't care about everybody else's properties. So that's what this one does. So let me show you a couple things. When you log into the backend, this is kind of the standard login screen that most of us will see on the backend with WordPress. but you'll notice one thing different about it up here at the very top. It says My Sites. Every other WordPress site that we've looked at throughout this series never had the My Sites option. It only had just the name of the site, and then you had all these navigation options. But this My Sites shows you that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 websites that this property management company currently handles under each one of those. So I'll show you a couple quick things. I'm going to open up a couple of these different websites in another browser, and we'll take a look at each one of them, and you'll notice that each one has its own look and feel and has the ability basically for each property manager to come in and manage whatever they want to. All right, so the first one is something called Campus Edge Apartments. This is one of those student housing apartment complexes that they manage, and as it pulls up here, you'll see that it has its own unique look and feel. And while that's loading, let me make sure these other ones preload as well. Again, when we're streaming this stuff, it sometimes takes it a minute or two to load in. But here is the Campus Edge Apartments, and here it comes to the screen. Takes it a second to load in. There it is. All right, so it says, welcome to Campus Edge. And what you'll see is there's navigation, there's places for residents to pay, there's icons, and there's all kinds of stuff that you would expect to see at a student housing complex, right? So they can apply today, and if I scroll up or down, there's all kinds of things to do with floor plans and specials and even a map of where they're located. So that's the Campus Edge Apartments. And then the actual main website is called Upstate Rentals, and they actually are the parent company of all of this. So they have a little bit different layout, right? They have some information about the properties they manage and main contact information, different logos, different look and feel, some really interesting photos and ideas that they have. They have a map as well. So that's their website. And then this last one here is what's called Paces Run. This is one of the most recent websites that they, properties that they acquired. So we just recently built this out for them. And there's some similarities between all the different websites, but each one has its own domain name, and each one can have its own completely different look and feel. We kept some consistency because we want people to realize that as an apartment management company, that if they're on any site that is related to them, there's a commonality there. There's a common brand look and feel, right? So we do that for this organization. So again, that may be a reason within your own organization to determine, does a multi-site strategy make sense where you have one login? So again, because I'm a master administrator, I can go into each one of these and I can manage each one of these websites separately and literally take care of anything on any site with either myself or anyone on my team as far as managing content. So what happens in a scenario like this, we might get 3 updates during the week, and one of them's for Paces Run, and the other one's for Campus Edge, and maybe something on Upstate Rentals. They're all different websites, but because my team has access to a single login, they can manage every single one of those websites without having to log in, log out, log in, log out, like you would do on a traditional model, right? So traditionally in the past, if I had 3 or 4 or 10 properties I'm managing, I would literally have to have separate websites for every single one of them. And in doing that, I would have to have separate logins for every single one of them. Now I can keep the same username and password and hope that nobody hacks it, right? But I could have that, but I still would have to log in and log out of every site to manage, versus the multi-site gives us the ability, log in one place, manage multiple web properties without having to log in or out consistently. All right, so that was one example. The other example is this one is a little bit different. So this is an organization that actually has multiple facets. They actually have their own web properties, but then they also host a client's web property, and we decided to put it all under one WordPress install. So they have a whole bunch of stuff that relates to the bariatric community and some bariatric surgical community, and so they have a community site. They have an actual dating site, and they have a couple of places where people can exchange, like buy things and shop. So we have that, but then one of the chapters of what's called the New York Bariatric Society actually has it's a chapter of an association, is connected to these people. So we actually have their sites and then also a chapter website. So we put it all under one bucket. And the fun part is the person that manages this New York State chapter up here, she has her own login and she knows what to do. She can log in anytime. But when she logs in, she's not a master administrator like we are. When she logs in, she doesn't see all of these sites. All she sees is the New York State chapter. So she can do whatever she wants on her chapter site. But if she gets stuck and she needs help, we can log in and support her from here as a master administrator. All right, so that's another example of one of those sites. The third one is this. This is a prayer ministry site. And what the business model or the structure behind this is, he bought a plugin that allows us to do multiple things for setting up prayer communities for all kinds of organizations. So every time we set up a prayer community, we're actually setting up another installation under this multi-site environment. So again, as master administrators, we can help manage all the prayer communities. But if you're a specific organization and you want a prayer wall where people can post prayers, both anonymously and post them regularly, and then people can go in and click a button and say, hey, I prayed for this, and then people can report back praises of answered prayers. That's a pretty cool way to do it. So we, again, put this in a multi-site environment. And right now he's starting to build out a little community, and he's got about 5 different sites right now. But he has the ability to add an unlimited number of communities under this model where we would be able to help him manage and expand and grow all of those prayer communities. It's a great little tool. And I can show you an example of one of the prayer walls if you're interested in that. It's actually kind of a neat concept. And what it does is you have kind of your logo and some of your navigation elements, but then you can go to the actual prayer wall. So it goes to this area here, and it's pretty neat. It's like I said, you can actually share a prayer, and then if anybody prays for it, you can just click this button. You say, hey, I prayed for this. The person who posted the prayer, they get a little notice in their inbox that somebody just prayed for them, right? So it's kind of cool. Or if I wanted to share my own prayer request, I can go in here and just put in my name, my email address, phone number, and I can share it anonymously, or I can not share it, which means it goes to kind of a shadow area that's monitored by moderators, and they can either share it in a different capacity, or they can just pray for it behind the scenes. I can put the prayer request here, and then I have the option to email me when anybody prays or prays for that. And so again, I would get notified in my little inbox that somebody prayed for a request I posted. It's kind of a neat ministry. It's a neat model. The guy that's behind this is a good friend of mine. He's really starting to see some traction of providing this as a model to support a lot of organizations that may already have a website, but they want an easy way for people that are connected to their organization to be able to pray and build some answers around some things. So it's kind of a cool option. But again, it's all multi-site, and it's all done here in the back end, and it's kind of really cool that way. So those are the reasons why somebody might want a prayer wall, right? Or a multi-site. That's why we do this. We have some ways for people to quickly manage multiple websites all out of one standard backend. So let me show you what it takes to create a multi-site. And we'll go through a couple things. This is where we start to get into technical side of things. And so I'm going to go through a couple technical elements. Whether we use SiteGround, again, that's one of our primary partners. We do stuff with GoDaddy and some other hosting environments. SiteGround is one of our preferred vendors. But whenever a website is set up, it has to be set up on a server, and that server has to have certain capacities and everything else, right? So There's two tools that we typically use whenever we create a website. One of them is this WHM. It stands for Web Hosting Manager, and it's where I can literally put any of my clients in their own sandbox so that they're not affected by anybody else on the server. So if one website gets compromised or attacked or hacked, it's not going to blow up everybody else's website. They're in their own sandbox, and that WHM allows me to put one person in one sandbox all by themselves, and nothing else is going to go, they're not going to affect anybody else on the server. So we use that to set them up initially. And then we use this thing called a cPanel, and I'll show it to you here on this other screen. And this cPanel is what allows us to create multiple websites or one website under any particular website. So I'm going to go into, let me go into that prayer wall one that we were just looking at. And this is like the control panel lets me get into all my other websites that I help manage for customers. I'm going to go specifically into that prayer wall site. And so behind the scenes, there's a lot of stuff that we can get into that gives us a lot of control over how websites run. Some of this, again, is more technical than most people care to look at, but we're going to cover some of that here. And it relates to what was on the slide. So on the slide, we talked about right here, and let me switch back to that and I'll go back into that. We're at the cPanel level right now when we're talking about how to set up a multi-site. We'll talk about MySQL, which is a database. We'll talk about the WordPress installation. And then the last two parts are these files. There's a config file and a domain mapping plugin, and we'll look at all of those together. All right, so here's the cPanel. When you log in, it gives you access to everything to do with that website in that area, including things like email accounts, if we have them set up for that, things like your databases, ways that domains are mapped to the site, and then also this MySQL database. So every time a WordPress website runs, it needs two primary things that are absolutely critical, otherwise the WordPress site won't run. One is MySQL, which it stands for, it's MySQL is the thing. SQL stands for Structured Query Language. It's a database that's been developed over time, and it's the most popular one out there, mainly because WordPress uses it. WordPress puts all your content in this database, and then when somebody types in your website, that page goes to the database and goes, oh, load all this stuff from the database onto this page and make it look like this, right? That's what the database does. It's its primary purpose. So the database is critical. The other side is what we call PHP. So I can actually even set the version of PHP back here on the cPanel, and most of the time right now, PHP is running at a PHP 7.0, 7.1, and 7.2 and 3 are the stable versions. There's older versions that are still out there, but they're actually, they're finding some holes and security problems. So almost every website that we currently manage is done in PHP 7 or above. Those are critical to getting the website running. So when you set up the website, you typically run through the install process to get it to be a multi-site. This is where we need, there's access to a specific file that they call it a web config file, or in this case it's a WordPress config file. And that config file actually has a lot of stuff in it. So I'm going to open this up and show you kind of some settings behind the scene. And there's actually some interesting things here. So this website that's running on praybefore.org is actually, there's a config file here, and there's a bunch of information out here. We're not going to show you everything on it because it does actually have some passwords and some things on it that are kind of sensitive. So we're going to scroll down hopefully to the bottom, and then we'll worry about some of the other types of things that are in here. So, okay, so this is the config file that tells WordPress how to run everything that's there. And there's a lot of information. There's like what the table looks like, and there's all this other stuff. There's this section down here about multi-site WordPress. And this is actually where you would paste or put all the directives in there to let WordPress know that this is actually a multi-site environment. I'll show you what it looks like when all that stuff's in there. It's actually under this folder here. So we'll load this one in, and I'll show you what's on there. So this text right here shows you everything about this multi-site environment. So these are, again, this is where it gets really technical. These are actually PHP commands that tell WordPress that when this site loads, it's allowing it to be a multi-site. So that's what this first command says. Hey, is this multi-site? Is this a WordPress multi-site? We hit true, which is basically saying, yes, it is. And then if it is, it says multi-site is true. Are we doing subdomains? And we can explain that a little bit later, but it's saying, are we using subdomains with this? What's the primary domain of the whole site, which in this case is praybefore.org. And then what are the paths, and there's other IDs and other stuff that's in here. All of this has to be pasted in here above this line that says, that's all, stop editing, happy blogging. Everything else down below we don't want to touch because this is actually critical stuff that the server runs off of. But there's this line right here that says, that's all, stop editing, happy blogging. That's where this multi-site stuff has to be put in above that in order for it to run properly. So we do that with all of the sites that we run that are multi-sites. We actually have sort of this configuration pre-made, so we just drop it in there. After we drop it in there, then the site allows us to see that multi-site option when you come up to that upper left-hand corner where it says multiple sites or multi-site. So that's step one, is the web or the WP config file has to be modified to enable that. Once it's enabled, then the next step, as we kind of had over here, the next step on our slide was setting up, we already did the WP config file. The next part is this domain mapping plugin, and I'll show you kind of what that looks like. Let me pull that up on this side over here. All right, so I'll show you the domain mapping tool and how it works. So this is where we can actually literally have a separate domain for every website that's in the multi-site. So under there's two things. There's a plugin, a master plugin that you enable. So I'll show you that on the master dashboard here. Pull that up. It's under what we call the network admin area. And so when you install these plugins, the plugins for the network admin area, you'll see there's something out here called multi-site or multi-domain mapping. Here it comes. It is called this right here, this plugin, WordPress MU domain mapping. And it says map any blog on a WordPress website to another domain. So this plugin, typically you can, like we talked about in our plugin session a couple sessions ago about plugins, you go out, you find add new, you search the plugin market, and you find this one that says WordPress multi-user domain mapping, and that's the one that's there. There's a couple other domain mappers out there. We found that this one seems to be the best, and it's on a current version, and it's by this is the author that creates it. Once it's active as a primary over all the domains, like the backend, what they call the network admin area, it's active there, then I can actually go into each one of these sub areas and actually map the right domain. So College Point was one we didn't look at, but it is a website. That's one of their properties. It's going to force me to log in because, let me hit the back button on that. Sorry about that. Not sure why it's forcing me to log in. Usually I'm already logged into all of these. So when you, so I'm going to go back into, I'll go back in just to the main Upstate property rentals one that we were just looking at. So let me go to that dashboard. We're logged in there. So there's an option to map the domain, and it's under this left-hand side, and it's going to be under your tools, I believe. Let me finish. Once this finishes loading, I'll let you know. Give it a second. There it is. Yeah, it's under tools. Under tools, it puts this option here for domain mapping. And it lets me set what the domain options are. So here it's Upstate Rentals without www. Here's Upstate Rentals with www. Or here's another possible domain to get there. There's a subdomain that we created when we were first creating this. So once I've created my site, I've created my multi-sites, and I want to set one up that's in here, I can actually come in here and put any web domain I want, as long as that domain is pointed at my server. The same place that this is installed on, the server behind the scenes figures it out. So when I type in upstate-rentals.com, it goes to that server. That server says, oh, it's this website, and this website is a multi-site, so it's going to put it in this sandbox. So it's kind of, again, there's a lot of steps to make it work, but once it's in place, then from here on out, all I have to do is just manage the website. So that's kind of how that domain plugin works. Again, there's a few steps involved in that, but it's kind of a really useful way to make sure that you can have one website, multiple domains, and multiple sandboxes, so that you can keep everything flowing the way you would want it to with multiple websites under one login. So that's kind of the high level overview of how the multi-site works, and some of the key configuration files that need to be looked at when we go through that process. So again, there's several things involved here. There's a cPanel, the MySQL and WordPress files have to be there. That once they are, then that WP config file is where you add the elements that allow it to be a multi-site. Once you do that, you activate and set up the domain mapping plugin, and now you have a multi-site environment. From here, once it's all set up that way, I can go into any of those multi-sites, add more sites anytime I want. I don't have to go back and check and deal with any of this stuff that you see on the screen. I don't have to go back and fix anything with control panels or the cPanel or MySQL. Once it's done the first time, I'm good to go. All right, so let's talk about what happens if your website goes through a sudden increase in traffic. So we're going to move out of the multi-site side of it. We're going to get into some more technical things that relate to how do we prevent a website from shutting down. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but if you've ever gone to a website that has been made known in the media, so maybe somebody highlights a viral story, maybe it's a touching story about an animal or human or somebody doing something good, the news media publishes it instantly, that website gets flooded with traffic, and 9 times out of 10, if people aren't paying attention, their website will shut down because they'll have so much going to it that the server doesn't know what to do with that. So it either goes really slow and eventually maybe a few people trickle through, or I've seen sites just go and say site not found or not reachable, right? So that's kind of what this next part is we talk about what's called a content delivery or caching network. Content delivery networks are not they're not new. They've been out there for a while. When Yahoo was out there and they were really popular for a while, they used a partner called Akamai, and it was a content delivery system that basically you would take Yahoo or you would take any website, and it puts the primary website on one server, but then it sort of copies it on all these servers all throughout the world. So that if I'm in San Diego and I was going to yahoo.com, I don't have to go to the server in Chicago to pull it up. I would pull up a local copy of it somewhere in a San Diego server, right? That's what caching does, is it just takes everything you have and it kind of copies it into another environment, and it's closer typically to the person that's trying to get to it. And it's also, they call it load balancing, meaning if there's 100 people hitting this one, but there's only 5 people hitting this one over here, it's not going to let me hit the one with 100 people. It's going to redirect me to the one that only has 5 people on it. So that's what content delivery networks are, and Cloudflare, and there's a couple others that do this, but let me show you what Cloudflare does. And again, this is one of the reasons why we do use SiteGround. I'm going to go back to that same cPanel we were in for the Pray Before site, and I'll show you a couple things. There's actually an option that's built in. It's a partner relationship that SiteGround has with Cloudflare, and I can click on this little Cloudflare icon, and when I go into this section of the cPanel, it gives me some tools that lets me decide whether or not I want to spin up Cloudflare for my website. The cool part about SiteGround is they offer 2 levels of Cloudflare. One is the free version, what they call a free account, and it gives you some benefit. It gives you a little bit of a buffer, or you can actually sign up for almost $12 a month and do this plus version that gives you a lot more updates and performance and security and all that. So again, this is kind of what it is. It talks about be faster, safer. It's just one click. Don't lag behind. Activate Cloudflare now. Basically, what it does is it's a content delivery network that would take your site from this server, copy it to one of the Cloudflare servers, and again, offer that ability to, if there's a lot of traffic coming into the main server, it peels off and sends some people out to different servers so that your site doesn't crash. The reality is, how many people are ever going to need these types of tools? Not a lot. However, if you are with your site, if you feel like you're in a position where you might have something as you blog or as you share information that could potentially gain the interest of a lot of people, then my recommendation is to have some level of Cloudflare or some other version of a CDN, content delivery network, set up so that your website will not crash if you get a sudden influx of traffic. So that's kind of what Cloudflare does. That's what the content delivery networks do. One of the other things that they recommend, and we do this on a lot of things, is there's server caching and there's also browser caching. There's 2 sides of what we call caching, and all that is it basically keeps it within a quicker way to serve up information. So if your website doesn't change a lot, right? Maybe the website, other than your blog, maybe all the content stays the same for weeks and weeks at a time, then we would recommend using both server caching and browser caching because it's going to load a lot faster to anybody. So server caching means it sort of takes a snapshot of your whole website, puts it in a static format, meaning it's not dynamic. Again, all WordPress websites typically are what we call dynamic. They have a database, they have code. The code talks to the database, it loads the page on demand versus having static content out there. Again, if your site doesn't update a lot, what we call server caching can take a snapshot of that, leave it on the server, and then you can tell it every so often to refresh or clear the cache, and then it will kind of re-snapshot it, right? So again, let me go back into our cPanel within SiteGround. SiteGround actually has some really great features for server-side caching. So it's cached down here. There's something they offer called Super Cacher. And again, I'll go in and show you a little bit about what this does. But Super Cacher gives you 3 levels of caching options. One is the information is most of the files. There's some other things that we'll talk about here. I'll show you that. But so this is the static caching, and we have it actually set up on praybefore.org. But I can come in here if I'm having problems viewing stuff. I can hit flush cache, and it will the next time it loads, it will send up a new version of it. But the static cache is the static pages. It's taking all of your content, making static information out of it. It doesn't have to load as much. That's one side. There's a dynamic cache, and this has to do a little bit more with how the server and the RAM and all that stuff. Again, this is a little bit more technical, but it talks about how it switches on and off between running. If you have a lot of people hitting it, sometimes that can be quite a problematic issue. So dynamic caching, and this is more to do with the actual calls between the database and code. So there's what we call meme caching or mem caching. And a lot of times we have that turned on as well. So that's on the server side. Now in the back side of it, what's really cool, there's actually one of the tools that we use, and it's actually provided by SiteGround for the WordPress community. And it's actually what we call it takes advantage of the browser technology. So you can actually do some of the caching within the browser. So every browser, including Internet Explorer, actually it's Microsoft Edge now, Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, all of them do what's called caching, which means if I visit a site today and I visit it 2 hours from now, rather than loading the whole site back in fresh, the browser goes, hey, I've been here before. I'm just going to serve up what I already have. Now that works great on, again, sites that aren't very active. So if your site hasn't been visited for days and I come back to it, chances are I'm going to reload it fresh. If it's a news site, for example, you go out to any of the news organizations, obviously their stuff's changing all the time, so they don't do a lot of browser caching because it doesn't make sense because their content's always changing. For most of us, our sites don't change every day, so we're not worried about too much of the caching stuff. So one of the things that's really cool about this is if I go into this setting here and look at some of the browser caching, I actually have this front-end optimization. I can combine some files. I can do certain things where it's going to take advantage of the ability to cache information within an environment. It's going to there's a lot of settings here that we use. Some of them we don't use because it breaks certain things. But even this thing like minify, JavaScript files and output files and CSS, it will crunch a lot of those down because then it allows you to have a faster page load, and that's also what caching can do as well. So we don't cover this a lot in this series, but we do when we get into some of the Google and search engine optimization. One of the influencing factors in SEO or search engine optimization is actually called page load speed. So we actually, going back to our presentation, we actually talk about server caching versus Google page speed. We highlighted a little bit just to let you know that Google will penalize you if your page doesn't load very fast. And so we work with SiteGround and we work with several other plugins to get the pages and the content to load as fast as possible within that environment so that you have a little bit better advantage maybe over your competitors their sites might load a lot slower, and if they do, sometimes Google's going to drop them down and bring you up because your pages are loading a little bit faster. There's a lot of fine tuning of search engine optimization. There's things like mobile sides of it, and there's everything. I mean, there's a lot. It's an entire 6-part series all in and of itself, and we will have something like that coming up. But kind of just keep in mind that the way your site is served up, the caching of it, the how fast it loads can be influenced by a lot of factors. It can be influenced by what's on the server. It can be influenced by what's controlling, like what plugins are controlling certain things within the site, like this SG optimizer. And it can also be impacted by your overall server company and how they load stuff and where it's loading from. So there's a lot of influencing factors, but that's a little bit about the content delivering side of it. And again, if something were ultimately to go viral, you want to make sure that it doesn't come to a standstill. You want to be able to have it load from multiple locations, and that's kind of where that content delivery comes from. All right, we're going to wrap up with this information here, and then we'll open it up for any questions, and we'll kind of close out this whole series with some other observations. But one of the things that some websites will require is a way to do transactions. So if you're selling a product, say you're selling coffee or you're selling shirts or hats or any type of thing, maybe even related to if you're doing a fundraiser and you're maybe selling items to raise donations and things for a nonprofit, all of those would need to go through some version of a payment process. And there's two types of systems out there. There's the e-commerce model, which is I have a product, I add it to my shopping cart, I go to a checkout page, I give you my credit card information, and I get the product. You ship the product to me. That's an e-commerce model. So we at this point have chosen to use WooCommerce almost exclusively. So every website that we've built that has any type of e-commerce is going to use this WooCommerce. The cool part about WooCommerce is just like any other plugin, there's a premium version and there's a free version. For 99% of the clients we've ever worked with, the free version is more than enough. And it has the ability to set shipping information, collect taxes if you need to. It has ways to connect with different payment processing. So WooCommerce is a great way to set up a store without really having to do a lot of monthly types of things, right? So I've seen some people that will try to set up a store and they'll go out and they'll use Shopify or they'll use some of these other big commerce types of websites, and they're good. They're actually a good model, but a lot of times you end up paying a monthly fee to use their platform. And if you don't have a lot of customers, you end up getting to a point where you're spending more money per month for the site than you are generating revenue, so it doesn't make sense. Whereas when we do WooCommerce, because most of the time it's free and it's part of what you built, you don't have as much of a monthly fee or any type of things unless you have a lot of weird plugins. With that said, collecting money is important through a lot of sites. We have used PayPal for our own stuff for a long time. PayPal is pretty solid. There are some things you got to be careful from what I'm starting to see with PayPal, where they're starting to get a little bit more involved in sort of social issues, society issues. And so if you are determined on any level to be a hate speech or anything that you promote can be interpreted that way, there have been some horror stories where PayPal will completely shut down their account, freeze the money until something gets resolved. The unfortunate part is in some of the faith-based worlds that I work with, some of my clients, some of where they're coming from is considered hate speech, unfortunately. It's for a lot of us, it's scriptural and it's what we believe certain scriptures talk about, but because of the rest of the world, sometimes there's a concept or a thought that this is actually considered hate speech. And so I've heard of it. None of my clients have had this experience yet, but I've heard of some situations where PayPal has actually shut down their account and not let them access the money. So with that said, there's other options out there. There's others that aren't as potentially can be a potential problem. So we work with a lot of these other processors. Authorized.net is actually probably one of the second largest payment processing organizations out there. PayPal would probably be number one. Square or SquareUp, I think, is what the original concept was. There's another one called Stripe. There's a number of what we call payment gateways that plug in very nicely to WordPress and allow you to process transactions, whether it's through a shopping cart model or you have maybe a page that has a donation button on it, and that goes through a payment process where donations can come in. All of those are really doable within the WordPress environment. Again, part of it really depends on your business model and what you're trying to do. And as long as you have a clear picture of what you're trying to accomplish, we can help kind of guide you down maybe the best payment or e-commerce option. That kind of hopefully gives you an overview of what payment and e-commerce really does on the websites. One final note, this is this is where it gets a little technical, but it's not too bad. So every website address, right? www.praybefore.org, which we just looked at, or upstate-rentals.com. There's really two key elements of every website address. There's the A record, which is called the address record. That's actually the website. So when you have www or you just have upstate-rentals without the W in it, that's the A record. That's the part that gets pointed at the server so that when you type that in, the server goes, oh, here I am, serve up the WordPress information, and now you have the website loads up. That's critical to make sure that that's pointed to the right location. If that ever gets broken, your website will never load. So sometimes if somebody's website breaks, that's one of the first places we'll look at is in your domain settings, whether it's GoDaddy or some other domain system. You actually, in most of those, have the ability to control where the A record is pointing. you can edit it. It's usually in something called DNS settings, and you would go in and you would make sure your A record is pointed to the right IP address, which is the server where it's located. And as long as those two are done right, your website's going to flow and run very well. However, MX records are also important to make sure they're taken care of. MX is mail records, so it has to do with your email side of the domain. So if I have upstate-rentals.com, or in my case, shoesoptional.com, my mail records have to be pointed in the right direction as well. We happen to use Google G Suite for all of our email and collaborative side of things. So my A record and my MX records are pointing to two totally different locations. My A record is pointed to my SiteGround server where my site lives. My MX records, there's usually with Google, there's 5 different settings that you have to point to Google so that all of your email goes through the G Suite. And so that's the mail record. So my mail goes to Google, it gets filtered, it comes to my Gmail inbox or G Suite inbox. I can, do everything. It's, even on my smartphone, I have that. That works really good. It's all integrated, right? So your MX records are extremely important, and I can show you a quick example of that back here on our cPanel. Again, that's another place where you can set most of this stuff up if it's set up right. Load that in. And I'll show you, this is an example of the Google, how the Google MX records are set up versus the actual A record. I'll show you that here. And again, in the cPanel, you have this option here that's an MX record. And then you'll also see down below, there's what they call the DNS advanced settings. Give this a second here. There it is. I had to refresh. So under cPanel, there's an MX entry option. And under that option, it's going to ask me what domain. Obviously, it's shoesoptional.com. When I select that, it's going to load in all of my records. And this is telling my website, my domain, to point all of my email over to Google. So down at the bottom, you see these 5 records that are down here. These are the ones that Google requires me to have in place in order for my email to go through Google G Suite. We work with Google a lot. We actually work with Microsoft a lot as well. We do both platforms. We personally just use Google. It's been a lot easier for us within the organization. That's how I set the MX records. And then the last part is I'll show you real quickly the A records for this. This is, again, more of the advanced domain name settings. We call it DNS. I'll show you here again under the advanced records. All of my shoes optional things, there's actually this right here. See how it says the type is an A record? This is the IP address where it's pointed. The www part of it is also pointed to the same thing. There's actually a couple other things down here. There's a domain key record, and then there's some of these other records that are important down here. This bottom one is what they call an SPF record. And we actually talked about that, I think, in this last slide here. No, we don't. But sometimes just a quick little touch on those. There's something called a DKIM, domain related entry in your DNS, and there's also this SPF. SPF stands for sender proof profile, I think is what it is, or spam protection is what it stands for. Long story short, what those relate to is how did your email get sent in and out from the server. So sometimes you'll have people, it's like, hey, I sent you an email and it always shows up in spam. That's because most likely one of their MX records are not set right, or one of these DNS records with how their email is authorized to be sent from one server to another. If it's not set up correctly, you're going to find sometimes email is always going into a spam folder. And if it is, you might need to go back and look at some of these more technical records. Again, that's something we do help other clients with from time to time. We'll look at a lot of their technical stuff and try to make sure everything's pointed in all the right directions. A lot of times what will happen is if you move from one server to another, that's where some of these things break. So anyway, those are some really kind of miscellaneous technical records that are important to get every website to run. And that kind of summarizes really basically everything we've talked about today. And we can open it up to the next thing here. But if there's any questions, I'll unmute everybody for a moment. But if there's any questions, we can kind of walk through that, and I'll share one last thing before we wrap up for the day. Everybody's unmuted at this point. Is there any questions on the technical side, multi-site, any of those things that we can help out with? All right. Keep an eye on your inbox. We are actually in the process of sending out on the 28th. We will actually have a social media webinar coming up, and it's meant to be just kind of a high-level look at social media. The good news is this one actually doesn't cost anything. It's just it's an opportunity for us to just show you some things high-level about social media. It's about a 45-minute webinar. It will be on Thursday at 4 p.m., kind of similar to this, but it's on a Thursday instead of Tuesday. And that will give you an idea of how some of this webinar stuff works, or social media stuff works. And then from there, we actually will be launching another multi-part series on social media, and we'll look at very specific things going on with Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We'll touch on Pinterest and a couple others. There's some emerging ones out there. There's a new one called MeWe.com. Me and then we. It's kind of an interesting play on some things. It may gain some popularity, and it may at some point replace some of these other platforms that are out there. Facebook, as you know, is in the news a lot, so there's a lot of problems going on with Facebook currently, and we'll discuss that when we get into that part of the webinar down the road. But that's where we're heading from here. This has been a lot of fun for us to put on. What you don't see is behind the scenes some of my team that have helped kind of make sure we got all this stuff organized and ready to go. We are planning on doing a lot more of these throughout the year. So if you know of anybody that's wanting to learn about WordPress, learn about social media, we're going to do some things coming up about Google. We actually have a whole boot camp series about marketing that we're getting ready to roll out, where we literally go through what are the best practices when it comes to marketing a product or service, and how do you find your right target, how do you define your brand, all of that kind of stuff's coming up. So kind of keep your eyes open, and if you know anybody that would benefit from any of that, feel free to shoot them our way. We'd love to have people connect with us, and hopefully we can provide value. That's our whole point on this, is making sure we give you the information that's going to help you make better technical decisions and marketing decisions and digital presence, get all of that tidied up. And that's kind of why we're here. So I appreciate your time, and thank you guys for being part of this series. We'll send out the final links on the rest of them. I think we owe you about 2 more links for the last couple of series plus this one. So we'll make sure everybody gets all 6 parts in an email, in one email, so you can review these and watch them again if you need to. But this gives you some really good information and a good starting point for all things WordPress. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again for your time, and we'll catch up on another webinar. Thank you.